I am super excited to see what kind of benchmark scores and real world performance we're going to see once Apple's M1 Ultra chip hits the market. However, I won't be buying one because I don't need one. And most likely, neither do you. So let's talk about why. Now, this isn't buying advice, and I'm sure there are people out there who can genuinely use the power coming out of this M1 Ultra, and I'm sure there's also people out there who just have money to throw around who are more than happy to spend the extra for the fastest chip Apple's making at the moment. But for the general consumer, I'm not going to give you buying advice, but I am going to tell you why I think the M1 Ultra is cool, but ultimately not necessary for the average buyer. To start out, I'm not saying that the M1 Ultra isn't a great piece of kit. This thing is really impressive. It's a really cool piece of engineering. It's essentially two M1 Maxes glued together. And while that kind of sounds funny, it's actually something we've seen before. It's not revolutionary like what Apple's pitching it as. The closest equivalent I can think of to what Apple's doing here is AMD's Threadripper system with the chiplet design, which is basically where you have two individual dies that communicate with each other over some sort of interlink. And because of how quickly they communicate and because they're on one package, the actual computer just sees it as one CPU. The only difference with what Apple's doing seems to be that they are having the chips communicate with each other on a die level, meaning that the dies are actually connected to one another. They're not separate like what they were doing in the chiplet design on AMD's Threadripper. Apple also pointed out that it is significantly more efficient than what Intel does with their dual socket design, even though Apple used to use Intel's dual socket design and was making dual socket computers even before they switched over to Intel with things like the Power Mac G4 and the Power Mac G5. But whatever, they've made a better version, I suppose. Actually, no, I don't suppose. Genuinely, it is a better way of doing it to have the two dies communicate with one another. The communication speeds are insane. It's not something that you as the user are going to see, but these two chips are communicating with each other at 2.5 terabytes per second. Again, you as the user are never going to see that. The only benefit is that the communication is so fast that they can literally tell macOS that it is just one chip. Pretty cool. However, the benefits that you as the user will see come from the fact that these two chips show up as one, doubling what the M1 Max was doing. That means instead of 10 CPU cores, you have 20. Instead of 32 GPU cores, you have 64. You're doubling the video encoders and decoders and the ProRes processing, the neural engine, everything is getting doubled, including the RAM speeds, which, may I remind you, RAM speeds on the M1 Max were already way faster than what we were seeing with the regular DDR5 sticks in PCs today. Let's double that. Why not, right? So you go from 400 gigabytes per second of transfer speed on the RAM to 800, and you're also doubling the capacity from 64 to 128 gigabytes of RAM. That's fast, and that's a lot. For reference, a single module of DDR5 RAM generally has a transfer rate of about 51.2 gigabytes per second, and while it doesn't quite work this way, in a perfect configuration of dual channel, you're still only running at about 102.4 gigabytes per second. So while many traditionalist computer people will probably prefer the upgradable RAM at 102 gigabytes per second, it's kind of hard to argue with 800 gigabytes per second, assuming that you buy the correct amount when you purchase the Mac. That is always the caveat with these integrated chip systems. So with that extra performance, Apple compared this chipset to their 28-core Mac Pro, which it handily beat, but they also compared it to a PC's CPU. They compared it specifically to Intel's 12900K and said it was 90% faster. I take a bit of an issue with this because the Intel chip is an 8 performance core and 8 efficiency core setup, similar to what we had sort of in the M1 Pro. So yeah, not exactly a fair comparison considering 8 cores are really the heavy lifters and 8 of them are not really meant for that. So 16 core is a bit of a misnomer. But even with that being said, Apple was still drawing 100 watts less on their M1 Ultra chips. So even with that, it's still pretty impressive how power efficient these chips are. Sticking with efficiency for a minute, Apple is claiming that the graphics in this chip are the equivalent of an NVIDIA 3090 while drawing 200 watts less, while also fitting in a box this size. That's impressive, but one of the things you also have to keep in mind is that NVIDIA chips in general have a different set of specific things that NVIDIA engineers into their graphics cards. So ray tracing is not going to be a thing that you're getting in real time with Apple's chip. You're also not getting CUDA cores, but I'm pretty sure Apple can make up for the lack of CUDA cores with their video encoders and decoders. And drivers in general are just not made for Apple to do gaming super well. So AMD and NVIDIA, when it comes to graphics, are still going to win in the gaming department, especially NVIDIA. But when it comes to raw performance in workloads, that can actually really add up really fast. So yeah, that's all cool, fine and dandy. Apple seems to have just knocked it out of the park with this chip. They are dominating a 3090 from NVIDIA strapped onto an Intel 12900K. Holy crap, why would I not buy this? Well, lots of reasons. The first one is that you can get a very performant Mac Studio for $2,000 with the M1 Max chip. And that M1 Max chip is going to be more than enough for most people's workflows. Even creative professionals who are just doing YouTube videos or wedding photography, things that aren't really that demanding, but definitely more demanding than what an M1 basic chip can do, that M1 Max is going to be more than enough. And if you want to beef the graphics cores up, you can pay an extra $200 and you're right there. Easy. But if you want to get into the starting version of the M1 Ultra chip, you are immediately doubling the price of the Mac because you're basically doubling the processor in the Mac. $4,000 starting out. Granted, it also comes with a terabyte of storage, but do you really want to spend $4,000 on what will 9 times out of 10 be your desktop machine for casual use, some video editing, some photo editing? This is from my perspective, and I know several people may, again, have a need for this, but with the just insanely efficient power that you're getting out of these chips, I genuinely don't see anybody but the most demanding video editors and the most demanding photo editors needing something more than the M1 Max. I mean, like, hell, I've been editing every video on this channel for an entire year off of an M1 Mac Mini. Has it been easy? Actually, yes, for a lot of it. And there's only been a handful of videos where I genuinely felt like I needed more RAM, more graphics, or more CPU power. And those are few and far between. And the last thing to keep in mind is that because Apple is essentially scaling their systems instead of reinventing the base core, you are still working with what is essentially a single M1 core, but you're getting 8, 10, 20. The single core performance between the M1 and M1 Ultra is going to be roughly the same. The only thing Apple is doing is adding more cores and, in this case, doubling a single CPU into 2 that talk to one another as one chip. In my opinion, I think the M1 Ultra chip in the Studio is going to be great for YouTube channels like MKBHD's or for studios who have a high enough budget to afford it and can generally use it, but don't have a high enough budget to buy something like the Mac Pro. I think it's going to fit well. But for people like me and potentially people like you who want a web browsing machine that can run 2 monitors, connect a bunch of accessories, edit some 4K video, and do photo work, I think even the M1 Max is a bit much, but it's definitely going to be better than spending the extra money for the laptop. The value is hard to beat on the M1 Max, and the M1 standard is just, in my opinion, perfect for home use, not great for standard video work. I'm rambling a little here, but like I said at the start, the M1 Ultra is a genuinely cool piece of engineering, and I cannot wait to see what the benchmark scores and real-world use looks like. But with all of what I've said, I don't need it. And potentially, if you agree with the things I said in this video and kind of fall in the lines that I was talking about, neither do you. That's been it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you guys want, make sure to subscribe. I have one more video for this week. That's going to be on Friday, talking about the wrap-up, sort of the last few things Apple talked about that didn't really catch my attention, but I have a few thoughts. And if you missed the video on Monday, check it out right over there. I talk about why I am buying an M1 Max Mac Studio. So make sure to check that out. Aside from that, like, subscribe, comment, the whole 9 yards, and I'll see you in the next video. Make sure to be there, and have a good one.